Hello and welcome to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most interesting backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go to sea level. I mean entirely at sea level, for a trail that is constantly changing ecosystems, from sand dunes to pine forests to palmetto and oak hammocks to cypress swamp and wet prairies, where we'll have to keep our eyes peeled for alligators. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we hike from the Atlantic coast to Lake Okeechobee on the Ocean to Lake Trail in southern Florida. Welcome to the show, everyone. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast. Also, as a reminder, we are now on YouTube as well. And I hope you'll subscribe on YouTube in addition to listening to the show through a podcast app, because on YouTube, you can, of course, comment and we can communicate. And so I think that's a great way for us all to interact and talk about these trails. Also, I've created some playlists on the YouTube channel so that if you're into a particular kind of hike or a particular region, you can find a list of the hikes we've covered by category. So even if you listen through your favorite podcast app, please also subscribe on YouTube to help get more visibility for the show. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe and comment on a few of your favorite episodes, but it will help the show greatly to grow and find a new audience through YouTube. So thank you for that. Let's do our Walking the Walk segment. This is our segment where we highlight listeners who have hiked a trail after listening to an episode and were inspired to go hike the trail from the episode. We have several Walking the Walk highlights on this episode. First is Peter Celeste, who hiked the Kumano Kodo in Japan. The Kumano Kodo was featured on episode 25. Peter said he used the same travel company that our guest used on that episode. I think our guest was Sam Peck, if I'm not mistaken. And Sam had used Kumano Travel, and Peter did as well. Peter did the same Nakahechi route that Sam did, although he added a day to stop at the Yunomine Hot Springs, which he said was a spectacular village with fantastic natural hot springs and beautiful centuries-old ryokans, which are traditional Japanese inns. So that's an option on this route. Another thing that Peter mentioned that's really cool is how the Kumano Kodo is one of only 2 UNESCO pilgrimage treks recognized by UNESCO. And the other, of course, is the Camino de Santiago, which we covered in episode 44. And if you've hiked both of those trails, like Peter has, you are entitled to get dual pilgrim status. And the trails apparently work in partnership with each other. But Peter said the Kumano folks went the extra mile to recognize dual pilgrims. They got special certificates. They got pictures that were posted on the website. They met the temple priest and even got to beat on a special ceremonial drum, which he says was a very cool experience that he couldn't recommend highly enough. So there you have it. You could hike both of the world's UNESCO recognized pilgrimage treks, which we've covered in episode 25 for the Kumano Kodo and episode 44 for the Camino de Santiago. So thanks to Peter for reaching out and telling us about his hike on the Kumano Kodo. Next on Walking the Walk is Wyatt Tuggle, who hiked the Foothills Trail in South Carolina, which we covered in episode 16. He and his hiking companions traveled from Indiana to South Carolina to do the hike. They started at Oconee State Park. There were 3 of them, and they covered 32 miles in the first 2 days of the trail, passing numerous waterfalls and rivers, so doing quite a few miles right off the bat. They met up with his cousin Gabe and Gabe's wife Laura at the end of the second day for some trail magic, pizza, and beers. So there you go. There's a good tip. If you have a cousin that lives in the area of a hike you're doing, you can have him bring you a special treat. And then Gabe actually joined them on the trail for the next few days as well. They were blessed with perfect weather, and there were plenty of streams to stop and cool off in. And they finished at Table Rock State Park and finished up by summiting Sassafras Mountain. So thank you to Wyatt Tuggle for telling us about his hike on the Foothills Trail. And then we have 2 walking the walks for the Zion Traverse, which we covered in episode 26. So first is David Poirier. Dave has been featured on this segment before. So Dave and his friend that he hiked the High Sierra Trail with also hiked this trail together. They hiked from Lee Pass in the northwest to the Grotto in the southeast. They did it as a 4-day, 3-night traverse. They bookend it, though, with 2 really cool day hikes, which are famous hikes in the area. They did the Subway at the beginning and the Narrows on the last day. He thought it was a great adventure, but one thing he mentioned is that it was a very hard hike to organize. And the reason for that is if you're going to finish a through hike by doing the Angel's Landing hike, you need to submit a lot of different options for dates and hours to get a permit for that. And you have to do that months in advance with a submission window that you have to research online. And the Subway hike also requires a lottery. And Dave mentions that that is a hike for experienced hikers only. As you may have seen pictures of that hike, it's underwater essentially, where you're wading. Also, he said you need to reserve your camping sites a bit after you get the Angel's Landing lottery. So this all presumes, I guess, that you want to do Angel's Landing at the end, and I can see why you'd want to, if this is your only chance to get out to Zion to do that. But I guess it could be a bit simpler if you didn't do that part of it. But a lot of people certainly want to do the Angel's Landing hike. And so it sounds like once you get that permit, you can then base your reservations off of the time and date that you get. And Dave also mentioned that you can only pick up your permit the day of or the day prior to your reservation. Also, just a tip, there are very few water sources. I guess it might depend on the time of year, but you do have to be careful about planning water sources on any desert hike or on any hike for that matter. Dave called it a black belt level adventure in terms of organization, but he thought the hiking was fantastic. And at the end of the day, it all worked out. Also for the Zion Traverse, we heard from Jack Petito. So Jack went out and did the Zion Traverse with his brother, some friends of his brother, and a buddy of his from college. They went in the beginning of May, and he thought that was great timing. They had beautiful weather. It was uncrowded the entire way, although he said that once they got to the valley, it was very packed. One of the highlights was getting to camp up on the West Rim Trail with an amazing view. And Jack said he really couldn't recommend this hike more. So there you go, 2 groups that went out and did the Zion Traverse that we covered in episode 26. Definitely one to consider and one that's high up on my list as well. Jack says next up on his list is the High Divide Trail in Olympic National Park, and he's considering the Uinta Highline and the Alta Via in the future on his dream list. So thanks again to Dave Poirier and Jack Petito for writing in to talk about their hikes on the Zion Traverse. So there you have it, 4 different reports on the Walking the Walk segment. I love that this segment is getting longer and longer and that we have more and more hikers doing these trails. I may at some point have to shorten my descriptions to fit it all in because I want to mention everybody. But I really appreciate you letting me know that you've done these hikes, and please continue to do so. It's really inspiring for me and for the listeners of the show. You can reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com if you want to tell us about a hike that you've done that you were inspired by the show to do. And if you include a few photos, I will post those on the Instagram account. So there you have it, walking the walk. Get out there and go hiking, and let me hear about it. Let's talk about our Trails Worth Hiking featured mini adventure. This is a new segment that I added last episode, where we cover a shorter hike that may only be a weekend in length that wouldn't be a big enough hike for its own episode, but is still notable. We're starting with a few of my own hikes that I've done recently, but I'm happy to hear about weekend type adventures that you've done. Let me know about those and we can feature those on a future episode. I'm recording this episode the day after getting back from this mini adventure. My wife Andy and I went to the Warner Mountains and we hiked the Pepperdine Trail to Patterson Lake. What are the Warner Mountains, you might be thinking? And that would be a good question. This may be the most remote mountain chain and hike in California. It is in the northeastern corner of California. It's a basin and range environment, a Nevada-like terrain of a solitary range rising out of high desert, like we covered when we talked about the Ruby Crest Trail in episodes 7 and 20, I believe, if I'm remembering the episode numbers correctly. So this is barely in California. You could see Nevada in one direction and probably could see all the way to Oregon in the other direction. This range was shaped by volcanic activity, but also more recently by glaciation. My wife Andy and I hiked 6 miles into Patterson Lake, which is a gem of a lake in a volcanic basin. It's really beautiful. It's below Warren Peak, one of the highest peaks in the range, which is fairly easily reachable as a day hike from the lake. We actually hiked up there. Didn't quite go all the way to the peak because it was a little much for us as far as the rock scrambling, but we got pretty close and had a beautiful view. The Warner Mountains are a remote but stunning range. As I said, most similar to the Ruby Mountains of any trail we've covered. And in fact, there is a longer loop hike that you can do here of about 45 miles, which I may cover someday on the show. But for this past weekend, we chose a more relaxed out and back to the lake. We spent 2 nights at the lake and one day pretty much relaxing and hanging out, doing some day hiking and some climbing up to the peak nearby. We timed this hike perfectly for wildflowers. It's early July as I'm recording this, but truly spring in the mountains up there in the northeast corner of California. I have quite a few itchy mosquito bites to prove it. We arrived probably only a couple of weeks after the snow had melted out, and there were still a few scattered patches. So if you're looking for something different, something beautiful and otherworldly, something not at all crowded, check out the Warner Mountains and the hike to Patterson Lake in Modoc County. To get there, you drive north on Highway 5 to Redding, which is about 3 hours north of the Bay Area, and then you head east on 299 to Alturas, California, a couple hours east. We stayed in Alturas the night before, which is a sleepy little town next to a national wildlife refuge, and it's at the base of the mountains. So we had a really great, fun weekend. Because we were only hiking 6 miles in, we were able to bring some luxury items. So we set up a hammock. And I have one of those ultralight chairs that you can set up. So we had both a chair and a hammock, which made for a nice couple of days at the lake. I will post some photos of the Patterson Lake Warner Mountains hike on the Instagram account so you can see this beautiful area. And hopefully some of you who have the opportunity someday to do this hike will do it. I really do think it's a hidden gem in California. All right. There you go. Our Trails Worth Hiking featured mini adventure. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you of our sponsor, Outdoor Herbivore, that makes delicious vegetarian and vegan backpacking meals. But as I always say, you don't need to be vegetarian or vegan to really love these meals. They are made with quality ingredients. They have lots of calories and they are delicious. They are packaged in easy boil in a bag packaging, but as I will explain for our newest offer, that isn't always something you actually need because you don't always actually need to boil water. All right, let me get to that in a moment. Thank you to all of you who bought the Trails Worth Hiking full day of meals packet that we had on special through Outdoor Herbivore last month. This month, though, and for the next couple of months, I think, we're featuring a new discount and a new special. And this is a no-cook or cold soak meal special. And this is something that Outdoor Herbivore has really raised my awareness about. Kim at Outdoor Herbivore is a big advocate for cold soak meals. And at first, it wasn't something that I was that excited about trying, but now I've tried it a few times and I absolutely love it. And I think if you try it, you will like it too. You can have delicious meals without needing a stove. Now, that can be something you can do just for lunch while you're on the trail, so you don't have to take out your stove. You just take out the meal, you add a half cup of water, put it in the package, stir it up, and 5 minutes later, your lunch is ready. But you could also do these for dinner, and I did that one night this weekend up in the Warner Mountains. You only need to cold soak them for about 5 minutes, so it's fairly quick. Even if you're taking a break for lunch from hiking, it's not so long that it adds time to your hiking day. And our newest deal that Outdoor Herbivore is offering to Trails Worth Hiking listeners features 3 no-cook salads. And these are hearty salads that work well on their own or even as a tortilla filler. The 3 are the Lazy Lentil Salad, the Open Sky Yasai, and the Pacific Crest Vinaigrette. I had the Lazy Lentil Salad this past weekend on the Warner Mountains trip, and I really loved it. The open sky yasai is kind of like an Asian stir fry, but again, served cold like a salad. And the Pacific Crest vinaigrette is the closest you'll get to a fresh salad on the trail through a freeze-dried backpacking meal. It has sliced almonds, raisins, and dried cranberries in addition to veggies and spices. So give cold-soaked meals a try this summer, which are perfect for hot summer days on the trail, or when you're tired and you don't want to have to pull out the stove to cook dinner. Go to Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com and find the Trails Worth Hiking meal packet and use the discount code TWHCOLD, TWHCOLD, to get 20% off for a limited time on this offer of 3 of Outdoor Herbivore's best cold soak meals. Thanks again to Outdoor Herbivore for sponsoring the show. All right, let's jump into the heart of the episode. Our guest on this episode is Richie Mulligan, who goes by the trail name Pecky Bird. As you will hear, Richie now has extensive experience hiking in Florida. In fact, he's probably hiked more miles there than most people. I love covering a hike that is in a unique environment, or at least an environment that isn't typical. As much as I love alpine lakes and mountain passes, there are lots of other environments worth exploring. And on this episode, we go to the other extreme from a mountain environment. It's an environment totally foreign to me, which makes it all the more alluring. And as you know, I want to raise awareness around multi-day hiking options in as many parts of the country and the world as possible. So I'm thrilled to be able to bring you this hike in southern Florida. Let's talk about southern Florida. When we talk about southern Florida, we are referring to the Everglades, of course. Let's talk about what the Everglades are. So Lake Okeechobee, where this hike either begins or ends, depending on which direction you hike it, although it is outside of Everglades National Park, essentially marks the northern boundary of the Everglades habitat. Lake Okeechobee is the largest freshwater lake in Florida. It's the 10th largest freshwater lake in the United States, and it's the second largest that is contained entirely within the United States, behind only Lake Michigan. The U.S. shares a border with Canada on all the other Great Lakes. Lake Okeechobee covers 730 square miles, or 1,900 square kilometers, but it is very shallow and has an average of only 9 feet of depth, which is less than 3 meters deep. The fact that this lake is really shallow is important. The Everglades are a large region in southern Florida of flooded grasslands, and Lake Okeechobee is an essential part of the Everglades ecosystem. The system starts with the Kissimmee River, which originates near Orlando, Florida, and flows into Lake Okeechobee. Because the lake is so shallow, in the wet season, the lake floods. Its flooding forms a vast, slow-moving river heading south. When I say vast, I mean vast. This is a river that is 60 miles wide, or 100 kilometers, and 100 miles long, so about 160 kilometers, that flows over the limestone shelf of Florida into Florida Bay at the southern end of the state. Everglades National Park was formed in 1947. The trail, though, is north of the park. So the fact that this is limestone means that this was former seafloor, which may not be surprising considering Florida's location and flatness, but the geological history may be different than you think. Florida sticks out from the American continent like a thumb sewn onto North America. That is because it is actually awkwardly attached. Florida was originally part of Africa, although it connected with North America about 300 million years ago, and Africa drifted east from a continental rift about 180 million years ago, leaving Florida attached to America. It has been above or below water numerous times over its history, and it is from its times as a marine environment that the limestone formed. This is a habitat rich in wildlife and very diverse in ecosystems. The primary feature is sawgrass marsh, but in between there are sloughs, which are water channels. There are also wet prairies, which are slightly elevated areas with more diverse plant life. The wet prairies are where alligators like to live. There's also tropical hardwood hammocks, which are basically small islands of hardwood trees. There's also cypress swamp and mangrove forest in brackish coastal waters. but there are also pine forests in some of the drier sections. So it has lots of interesting habitats. I mentioned alligators. Let's talk about alligators for a minute. Nothing is perhaps more emblematic of the region than alligators. An alligator is a big crocodilian reptile, up to 4.5 meters or about 15 feet long for adult males. They can weigh up to 1,100 pounds or about 500 kilograms. As opposed to many species of crocodiles, there are only 2 alligator species, one in the southeastern United States and then the other in China. Alligators are different from crocodiles. They have a broader snout, they have an overlapping jaw, and a darker color than crocodiles. The strongest lab-tested bite of any living animal is from an alligator. That said, there have been some tests of saltwater crocodiles more recently that may be as strong or more strong. But the bottom line is pretty much nothing on Earth bites down harder than an alligator. Despite its huge biting force, though, its muscles to open its jaw are pretty weak. So a human or even duct tape can actually keep the jaw shut. You may have seen people wrestling alligators on TV specials or YouTube, and this is how they're able to do it. They can just hold the jaw shut. Alligators are apex predators. They will eat just about any animal they can find. They are capable of killing humans, but attacks are rare, though encroachment of development into alligator habitat can be a recipe for uncomfortable encounters. As you probably know, in recent times, humans have had an enormous impact on the Everglades, this flooded grassland habitat. So let's back up in time and talk about the human history of the region. Indigenous people arrived to Florida about 14 to 15,000 years ago. At the time, it was an arid landscape, which lasted until about 6,500 years ago. Then the climate again shifted about 5,000 years ago, creating the flooding system I previously described, which formed the Everglades. At this point, the Calusta and Tequesta peoples emerged. These were the peoples first encountered by Spanish explorers in Florida. The Spanish arrived in the 16th century. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon claimed it for Spain. He claimed not only Florida, but a vast region of the southeastern part of the continent, including what is today Georgia, the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, and even parts of what became Louisiana. But by the 18th century, French and British settlement pushed them back to the areas around St. Augustine, Pensacola, and St. Mark's, all within present-day Florida. In reality, Florida was never that important to Spain. And in 1821, it was transferred to control by the United States. Spanish and later other European contact with indigenous peoples in the area led to disease, which is something that happened pretty much everywhere indigenous peoples of the Americas came in contact with Europeans. The decline of indigenous peoples in the area actually weakened Spain's interest in Florida because their interest in Florida was primarily missionary. In other words, to convert the natives to Christianity. So I guess it was a bit inconvenient that many of them were dying from European diseases and made it not worth it to continue the mission and missionary system that they were imposing in Florida. As groups began to die from disease, other groups eventually filled the void. The Creeks, who were indigenous peoples that came from north of Florida, moved into the area and also subsumed what was left of some of the existing peoples, and together they formed a new group with a name that you will recognize, and that is the Seminole Nation, which was formed in northern Florida. But the Seminoles were eventually forced south into the Everglades region by the U.S. military in the 19th century. So unwittingly, they became residents of the Everglades. The conflicts with the Seminoles were known as the Seminole Wars, which took place in the 1850s. And that brings us to Jupiter, Florida, the city where the hike begins. Jupiter has a famous lighthouse, the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse. This lighthouse was planned to be built in the 1850s, but construction was delayed due to the Seminole Wars. The lighthouse was completed in 1860. Jupiter is located where the inlet reaches the Indian River. This had been a meeting place for indigenous groups for thousands of years and was considered a good strategic place for the U.S. military as well. And it is where they built Fort Jupiter, though that fort became very hard to supply and it didn't stay open very long. So let's talk about the impact of modern life on the Everglades environment. There are a number of problems that modernity has brought to the Everglades. One problem is a number of invasive plants and animals. For example, the Burmese python is in the Everglades now, which is essentially, I think, an escaped pet. I guess people who thought their python pets got too big would just dump them in the Everglades, and they've gone on to breed there. As far as plants, there's the Brazilian pepper, there's the Australian pine. There's also been a huge growth in urban and agricultural development, which has actually cut the size of the Everglades in half. Southern Florida today has more than 8 million people, so that is creating a huge impact on that environment. There's also pollution from fertilizer coming from upstream and sea level rise from climate change. Despite all of that, it is still a fantastic, wild environment, more so than you would think would still be in a place as populated as Southern Florida. The Ocean to Lake Trail itself is relatively new. The route was explored in 2004, and parts of it have been open since 2012. The Loxahatchee chapter of the Florida Trail Association maintains, promotes, and improves the Ocean to Lake Trail, and that is one of their main responsibilities, is to make this trail a great trail for all of us to enjoy. All right, with that history and introduction, let's jump into my conversation with Richie Mulligan, aka Pecky Bird, about his hike on the Ocean to Lake Trail in Florida. Richie Mulligan, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
So one of the things that's interesting is where you are right now. Where are you and what are you doing there?
Right now, at this moment, I am in Death Valley National Park. I am working right now as a general store clerk and a housekeeper at Panamint Springs Resort, a resort built by the cousin of Buffalo Bill in the 1800s, which was later, it was a miners' camp, and it was later turned into like a resort for passersby in the 30s. Right here is just a good place to save up some money while getting in some hiking and staying in shape. It's kind of like the perfect place, I think, at least for me. Not a whole lot of signal. I'm 70 miles from the closest town right now. So if I need groceries, it takes me about an hour and 10 minutes and driving through some pretty gnarly mountains.
That's pretty cool. And one of the things that I was going to ask you, and I think you sort of answered, is whether you're getting an opportunity to hike while you're there. And it sounds like you are. So that's cool.
All the time. Right now, I'm at 3 days off a week, which is super nice just because it's been a little bit slower. So I'll take my backpack out for 3-4 days at a time. I'll go explore cabins. I'll go explore mines. There's tons of mines around here. And then there's great canyons as well.
Awesome. So we're going to be talking today, though, about a trail that's on the other side of the country in Florida.
A little different, yeah.
Yeah. How did you learn about this trail, the Ocean to Lake Trail? I'll be honest, I had not heard about it until you reached out to me. And I thought it was really cool because I'd heard of the Florida Trail, which is something like, 1,000 miles long or something. It's a really long trail.
Miles.
And I was trying to think, is there, I hadn't heard about a trail in Florida that's more doable in a week or doable in a few days. And it was really cool that you mentioned this. So I was just curious how you heard about it and how you ended up hiking it.
Sure. So the Ocean to Lake Trail is actually an offshoot of the Florida Trail. I was in wintertime. I was living in New England a couple of years ago, and I was really like getting the itch to hike. And I don't have a lot of snow experience, especially at that point. So I was looking for something warmer. I figured Florida might be good, and I started looking up. I follow this hiking creator, Jupiter, who is from Jupiter in Florida, where this trail starts. And he has a great video series and a great webpage about the whole thing. So it just seemed like the right opportunity. It wasn't too expensive to fly out there. The lodging's pretty easy. So it's a pretty easy trail, pretty accessible if it's your first trail, which it was my father's first time ever going backpacking. I took him out there.
Oh, that's cool. So you did this trail with your dad?
I did do it with my dad. It was his first time staying overnight outside, really ever.
That's awesome. That's great. So what did you do to go about planning it? Was it pretty much just get on the Jupiter site? Because by the way, I found the Jupiter blog post and that was enormously helpful to me in preparing for this conversation. So was that basically the main resource or were there other resources out there?
So I used that primarily to like visualize the trail and come up with some options for campsites. I also went through the Loxahatchee Facebook group and their website for maps and stuff like that. There in the Florida Trail, I ended up hiking the Florida Trail after I got off this trail, but all of the Florida Trail Facebook pages are just super helpful. The community around that trail is just phenomenal. They love that trail. So I use that, and then Far Out has a map that we used on the trail that'll track you with it. So it's pretty easy.
Did you hike the entire Florida Trail?
I hiked the entire Florida Trail.
Congratulations. That's a big through hike.
Thank you. It was so much fun. I did it as a flip flop. So I actually quit my job after the Ocean to Lake Trail, started hiking north. I got to the Panhandle and then went right back to the Ocean to Lake Trail and hiked southwards.
Awesome. Awesome. You tried to make it as far as one of the big through hikes in the U.S. by doing it two times.
Yeah, basically.
Have you done some of the other big ones too, like the Appalachian Trail or the PCT or the CDT?
Not yet. I've section hiked the AT. I have plans to do the PCT maybe next year. Mm-hmm. I've done about half of the Ice Age Trail in Wisconsin.
Oh wow!
Which was I really like the smaller ones with less of a bubble.
Yep, I understand. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about when the best time to do this trail is and how far it is and how long it takes to do.
Sure. It's a 61 and a half mile trail. Since it's Florida, it can get pretty hot there. So I would say avoid doing it in summer. We went in January, at the very beginning of January, and I think that was probably a perfect time. It gets a little chilly at night, but there's no mosquitoes. There's still water around because by March, the Everglades kind of recede a considerable amount, which can be pretty dangerous for like water conditions without any water around. I was in a pretty scary situation on the Florida Trail, but I'd say December to February would be like the ideal times. And then you could get a couple of months on either end of that would be good.
And so since you're a big time hiker and have done a lot of longer hikes, it sounds like, I'm glad to hear that you did this trail with your dad. What was the pace doing it with your dad? How many days?
We did it in 5 days. Our biggest day was a 16-mile day, and that was followed up with a 15-and-a-half-mile day. But other than that, it was around 10 miles a day for 5-6 days.
And you think that's a pretty comfortable pace for most people?
It was a delightful pace. There's not too much in terms of elevation change. I think the highest point's around 200 feet. Yeah, I think that's a very comfortable pace. I think the fastest known time might be held by Jupiter, and I think that's at like 48, 49 hours. And I've seen people do it in like a week as well. So there's considerable options. The infrastructure of it allows for a unique trip every time.
And you mentioned the situation with water at times. So is this a situation where you're filtering water along the way and there's nothing provided, I would imagine?
There's a couple of pumps in some spots. A couple other times you'll be by like a park entrance or the trailhead will have some water. But yeah, most of the time you're just picking up between your legs in the swamps and filtering it. And at that point I was filtering. At this point, I probably wouldn't. I stopped filtering on the Florida Trail and just went for some bleach.
Okay. What about walking in wet terrain? Because in January, as you mentioned, there's still quite a bit of water, which on the one hand is great because you need it to drink. But on the other hand, you're probably trudging through it quite a bit. So how is that on this trail?
It can be tough. If you're not willing to just accept the situation as it is, you're going to have a bad time. But the minute that you accept, hey, I'm going to be putting on wet socks in the morning. Hey, I'm going to be walking through miles and miles of water. It's pretty great. You get to enjoy cooling feelings between your legs and stuff. It's kind of interesting to like walk slow and be conscious about every step you're taking. Because otherwise you're going to walk into like a cypress knee, take out your foot.
Right.
That's something that was important is like foot maintenance on the Florida Trail and this trail because it's so wet and you're rubbing. I advise many shoes off breaks, socks and shoe off breaks.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What about sun exposure? I know January is a good month to go because it's not terribly hot. Are there big enough trees to give you some shade, or is this pretty much wide open the whole way?
In certain sections, you're going through forests, so you'll have plenty of shade. And other sections, you're walking on sand dunes and you're completely exposed to the elements, even if you're walking through water. The reflection will come up. So if you have an umbrella, which I didn't, I would use it. I would totally bring an umbrella, and the weather can shift. So it can be like rainy one day. You might have a whole trip of water. It really depends. You're in a location where it changes frequently.
I was talking to my wife and I was telling her I was going to be talking to you about this trail in Florida. And I think her reaction was probably the reaction a lot of people would have. So I'm going to ask the obvious question. She said, "What about alligators?"
Yeah, they're gators, all right. They don't typically pay you any mind. The only times that I'd say be significantly conscious of it is around dawn and dusk if you're going in the water to fill up, because that's around the time that the deer go to drink, and that's when they're starting to prey. Aside from that, most of the time you'll just see them sunning out. They're pretty skittish of you, and they'll walk out of the way if they hear you coming or see you coming. I saw 3 alligators on this trail.
Okay. What are the campsites like? Are they up on platforms? Are they on the ground, or does it vary depending on the spot?
They're on the ground. There's no real platforms in any of the area. The first campground that we went to, so we went from the ocean to the lakes. Most people actually do it the other way around, despite the name. So Kitchen Creek campsite had a pit toilet and a pump, which was a delight to see. They have, most of the places have like fire pits, but most of it's on the ground. There's a lot of good opportunity for hammock camping. That's actually a really great one. There's one camp that's in the middle of an island, so you have to actually go through the water at the end of the day, which was kind of cool, except for the next day it was freezing when you woke up, and you just have to go through the water to get off the island, you know?
Yeah, well, that'll wake you up fast.
For sure. A couple of the campsites have permits. I believe Kitchen Creek and the Lucky Hammock campsite, you need to call ahead.
Okay.
That's pretty easy as well.
And what about navigation on this trail? Is it pretty much, marked well where it's easy to follow, or?
Yeah, it's beautifully blazed.
Okay.
It uses the Florida Trail orange blazes. We used gut hooks at the same time, like in spots, like trying to find the campgrounds that were off trail. But you don't go like 5 feet, 10 feet without seeing another blaze. It's super well marked, and they do a great job maintaining the trail too.
Is it actually part of the Florida Trail, or is it an offshoot of the Florida Trail? Because it's east to west, which surprised me to hear that it would be part of the Florida Trail.
It's an offshoot.
Okay.
It's kind of like the Blackwater connector, which goes up to the Alabama Roadwalk.
And where do people start this trail? Where do they need to go to get to it? It's in southern Florida, so is it pretty much get to Fort Lauderdale or Miami?
Yeah, we flew into Tampa and rented a car and drove over. That was the cheapest route for us. And then we stayed in West Palm Beach, which is where the trail starts. It starts at Hobe Sound in Jupiter on the Atlantic Ocean. Alternatively, you could start in Lake Okeechobee. That would require a little bit more, like going online asking for maybe a trail angel on one of the Facebook pages kind of thing. But Ubering on the West Palm Beach side, on the eastern side, is super easy. That wasn't a problem at all.
What about getting back from Lake Okeechobee?
That was a little bit more challenging for us.
Yeah.
So there's signal there. There's no problem like connecting to the internet and trying to call a shuttle. It's just the Ubers around Lake Okeechobee are very lacking. There's maybe 1 or 2.
Okay.
So we got lucky and caught a hitch from someone who we had met who had also hiked the Ocean Lake Trail. And it was like magical timing the way it worked out, because he was supposed to have been long gone, but happened to have had a little kink in his plans that let us get a hitch from him. There's a highway that goes around Lake Okeechobee that you could start walking on to get a hitch. There's also campgrounds within 18 miles of the Neenah Trailhead, which is where we ended on the southern end of Lake Okeechobee.
Okay. And what about permits? Is there anything other than the 2 potential campsites where you might need to reserve that you need to get?
No, there's no like hiking permit or like national park permit. There's a few campsites with permits. There's the Scrub Jay campsite, the Kitchen Creek campsite, and the Lucky Hammock campsite, which would need permits.
And it sounds like night before you've got West Palm Beach. If you wanted to get into town the night before you started hiking, you could stay there.
Yeah, and that'd be super easy. There's even an airport there if you want to fly into there. It's probably a little bit more expensive, but
right. Okay. And so we talked a little bit about how there's some open space and there's some shade and there's water. And I think I have a picture of what this looks like. And I did look at that post online, but maybe for listeners who haven't been to this part of Florida or haven't been to a wild version of this part of Florida, you could talk a little bit about what you're going to see along the trail and what the terrain is like.
Yeah, I'd love to. I would say this is a perfect trail for someone who's even considering doing the whole Florida Trail. I think it's a perfect encapsulation of every single environment that you see along the Florida Trail within the 62 miles. You go from sand dunes to going into like cypress forests all around you with little knees of the fallen trees going up. You're walking through swamps. There's a couple of miles of road walk, which is very common on the Florida Trail. There's farmland that you're walking across levees. And I would like to point out, don't grab your water from those levees. They have a lot of chemical runoff
Okay.
that you can't really filter out. There's wet prairies. There's palmettos all around you. So you got all those like cool fans in your face. We saw cacti at the beginning in the sand dunes, which was cool to see. Some oaks. And then you get to see the freshwater lake as well as the Atlantic Ocean, all in that short amount of time.
Yeah. So if you are going from east to west, how does the terrain change from there? Is it in the order that you just described it pretty much, or how does that work
Pretty much.
going across?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it starts off in you start off with a road walk with like oak hammocks. It's a beautiful section of Jupiter walking down that road. And then you turn into Jonathan Dickinson State Park, which is mostly the sand dunes. And then you'll get into the cypress forest or the pine forest as well. You might encounter some water, especially on particularly wet years. We didn't really get water until our second and third days, in which we got deeper into the cypress forest and then into the wet prairies. And then you get some road walk, then you get some boardwalks. I love a good boardwalk, and Corbett Park has some great boardwalks over there. Then you get through to the farms and then a little bit more road walking, and then you're at the lake.
So other than the road walking and the boardwalks, which are probably pretty easy, how is the trail itself? I mean, there's a lot of walking in water, it sounds like, at least certain times of year. So what can people expect as far as time to cover miles, right? Like if you think about, people talk about some of the trails like the PCT being kind of a highway because the trail is so easy to walk in some ways.
Yeah.
But I'd imagine here with going through water, over sand dunes, boardwalks, things like that, it might be a little bit slower pace.
Yeah, the sand dunes can be a little tough, especially because you're just falling into them. It's just sand. There's certain sections of the water where it's like up to your mid shins that isn't too bad to walk through, but there's other parts that you might get up to your like waist in water, and that's that you get significantly slower in that. But overall, I'd say mostly flat, and once you get over the wet feeling in your shoes, mostly flat water.
Is this something you could do the whole trail in sandals, in hiking sandals, or is it better to have closed-toed shoes?
I would prefer the closed-toed shoes just because you can't really see where you're going through. If you want to slow down to a pace that you feel comfortable in sandals, that's totally an option.
Okay. How did you think about an itinerary here? Was it sort of just lining up campsites? I mean, I guess the question is, are they obviously spaced apart one day at a time, or are there more campsites than days and you kind of have to pick where you want to go each day?
I would say at the pace we were doing it, there's more campsites than days because there's some campsites that are like 4 or 5 miles apart. I would say overall, you could probably hit 2 to 3 campsites a day if you're spreading it out.
Which were ones that you would recommend people look to stop at? Are there particular favorites?
I liked Kitchen Creek at the very beginning. Those are wide open spaces, and you get the luxury of having a place to go to the bathroom in a pit toilet.
Right.
And you have a pump water. We really liked the Soggy Socks campsite, which was made by Boy Scout and Eagle Scout troops.
Okay.
And there was like nice areas to hang food and put a hammock if you so like. The Loop 4 campsite was pretty spacious. We saw a gator in where we were filtering our water, so that's cool to see if you want to see that. And I would say don't miss an opportunity to camp on an island. You get your whole like island to yourself.
Right.
You can miss it and add an extra 4 or 5 miles to the next one, but the island one was pretty cool.
Which one was the island one?
Bowman Island campsite.
Bowman Island. Okay, cool. And you just mentioned hanging food, which brought to mind, other than gators, what is the wildlife like out there? Are there reasons to hang the food to avoid critters and that kind of thing? Yeah,
there's rodents, mice, squirrels, stuff like that. There's hogs. There's wild hogs. It's actually a pretty big problem out there.
Yep.
They'll root around. If you get into some hog trails, that can be tough because it's all rooted up and you have no idea where to place your feet. There's actually bears in Florida, which surprised me. When I was going through Ocala National Forest, I saw a juvenile black bear. It was tiny little guy, but it surprised me. So we just hung our food pretty much every night. Yeah, there's deer. And then there's a lot of birds, especially if you're going in the winter. They're flying south for the winter, and you get to see all of the birds there.
Yeah, cool. And so were you doing like a true hang, or was this just sort of put it up on a branch a few feet above ground to keep critters out? Or was this more like flip it over a high branch, pull it up and secure it?
For a couple of the sites where the gut hook comment said that there were rodents, we actually did a significant hang, but most of the time it was just like attaching it to like the hammock thing.
Okay. All right. Any other particular challenges that we haven't talked about that people should be thinking about in preparing for this hike?
Rain. I would say rain is always an option in Florida, and the weather can switch like that around there. It's actually kind of nice, especially on a hot day, to get rained on, but you just have to be comfortable with being wet.
Right.
Aside from that, if you're going in March or maybe November, you could see the possibility of like mosquitoes, significant mosquitoes, especially walking through the swamps. January, they're not actually a big problem. Saw a couple maybe. But yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of things to keep an eye out for.
And what about any possible side trips or detours worth doing, or anything worth seeing along the way, or at least planning to at least make sure you see?
I would say spend some time after you're done, like at the KOA campsite, and go around the area of Okeechobee. Okeechobee's fantastic. They run all sorts of tours, whether it's on the actual lake or around. They do hunting tours and stuff like that.
Okay.
You could spend some time in Jonathan Dickinson State Park, but there's not really opportunities for like side trails, given that it is a side trail.
And so I usually ask people why this is a trail worth hiking and why it's something that they should consider of all the other trails that are out there. One of the things I heard from you is about how this sort of encapsulates what you can see on the entire Florida Trail, which I think is really cool in a short distance.
Yeah.
So I think that's a definite reason. Any other reasons come to mind as to why someone should consider doing this trail?
I think the feeling that I got when I was done, it's like every other hiking trip where you're like, wow, I did that. I'm proud of myself. But on top of that, you're going through swamps. It's kind of crazy to say. And people always ask you like, oh, were you safe from the alligators? Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And that feeling's kind of cool to overcome those sorts of things, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I get that question a lot here in California when I go in the mountains. People are always saying the same thing about bears. And I imagine the alligators are somewhat like that, which of course they could be a problem, but most of the time you know how to keep your distance and not worry about it.
Exactly. Yeah, they don't really care about you.
All right. So I'm curious how your dad felt after this trip. Did he really love it, or was it not for him, or what was his experience like?
He loved it. He loved hiking and backpacking. He fell in love with it. I think without that experience, he would have been less inclined to be supportive of me through hiking.
Yeah.
But seeing that he was like so on board, was like, you need to be out there for months on end. I was like, thanks, Dad. During the trail, he got significant blisters.
Okay.
Which was tough because he wasn't really airing his feet out as much as he probably should have been.
Yep.
That was frustrating for him, but he was very glad that he went through the experience.
Well, it sounds like maybe you guys have some more trips in your future together.
Yes, for sure. I'm trying to get him to come out to Death Valley. It's a bit of a stretch because we're from Rhode Island, New England. So it's a bit of a hike to get out here, but I'm hoping he comes.
Do you have a particular moment or memory from this trip that'll stick with you for a long time?
Yeah, there was, after the first night at the Kitchen Creek campsite, we had actually forgot our propane the first night, which was a disaster because we didn't want to cold soak our food.
Yeah.
So we made a little fire and we got some water boiling. And just after all of the nonsense of realizing we're going to have to go off of this trail to grab propane, which there are opportunities to do that. We sat around with like coffee in hand because I had a little French press, a backpacking French press thing. And just sitting there after a hard day's work, seeing my dad who did it, he didn't think he was going to be able to do it. Oh, it was just such a blessing to be there with him and hear the birds. We could hear owls hooting with the campfire. The sun was setting. It was just perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, sometimes even a mistake can turn out to be something that's great, right? Like you never know what's going to happen when a hardship can turn into something that's your most interesting memory or most special memory. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Anything happen that you didn't expect or anything you would do differently than what you did if you advise somebody else to do this? And maybe just in general about hiking in Florida, since you have so much experience doing that.
Yeah, I would definitely say if you're not hiking in toe socks are a great piece of equipment. I hate the way they look, I hate the way they feel, but gosh, do they prevent any sort of blisters? Any sort of blisters. I would hike with an umbrella this time, just like for sun and for rain. I would probably, if I'm going to do this trip again, I would do it a little bit quicker. I'd probably do it in 3 or 4 days, or I'd do a yo-yo, which would be going back and then forth to do
Mm-hmm.
it twice, see it a little bit differently, and maybe see some of the different campsites.
Okay.
In terms of things I would do differently, I wouldn't
Yeah.
forget our water bottle in our Uber, so we had to go to a gas station an extra 2 miles on the first day. And I wouldn't forget the propane, though we got to meet a pretty sick guy we took a hitch from on the way to Walmart.
That's funny, man. You're an experienced hiker and you left your water bottle and your propane.
Mm-hmm. It happens to everyone, literally everyone.
I was gonna say that's the lesson here is that like if when you do those things, it's not the end of the world. It happens to everybody. You'll figure it out.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Richie Mulligan, thank you for telling me about your hike on the Ocean to Lake Trail with your dad. It sounds like it was a pretty cool adventure. But while I have you, I've got a few more questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So okay, I don't know if the answer is going to be toe socks, but we'll go with what is one piece of gear you don't leave home without?
Toe socks would be a good runner up, but I
Okay.
have this delightful little contraption. It's a portable bidet, and it can fit inside small water bottles and bigger water bottles. I use it so I don't have to take as much toilet paper. It's easier for leave no trace, you know. I don't want to hike out with like dirty toilet paper, and it gets everything so clean. It's perfect. It's perfect. A bidet.
Okay, so you're just so because we're on audio, you were holding up what almost looks like a wine bottle stopper kind of size thing, right? Like it's almost like has that look to it,
Exactly.
and it goes in is it like in a squeeze water bottle, like a soft side water bottle, and you can get like
Yeah.
a spray out of it.
It'll fit in a smart water bottle, which is what I primarily carry for water, and it's got a good stream.
All right, I have to ask the question because are you a no toilet paper hiker and you only use the bidet, or is this a complementary tool?
I carry a little bit of toilet paper to dab dry.
Okay.
It is the primary tool.
Nice. Yes. My friend Tony, who's been on several episodes that I hike with, he also uses one of those. So I don't know if he wanted me saying that to the world, but I just did. So, oh well.
I won't leave home without it. I really won't.
I may have to go that route. They sound like they're pretty helpful. What's the next trip on your list?
So right now, I have 2 on my horizon. Next month, I'm going to be attempting to do what's called the lowest to highest trail. And it starts in Death Valley at Badwater Basin, 282 feet below sea level.
Yep.
And then it goes 130 miles west to Mount Whitney.
Yeah.
So I'll be doing that in hopefully about a couple of weeks' time.
Awesome.
We'll see how the snow's looking because we're getting snow right now in those mountains, but we'll see.
Yeah.
And then after that, oh, you go ahead.
I was going to say Whitney's a little bit challenging this time of year. Are you bringing the ice axe and all of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I am. And I'll be okay if I can only get to the portal as well. I won't be disappointed.
Yeah, I was actually up on Whitney in September with my son. It was the 4th time I've done it, and I didn't think I was going to do it again, but he wanted to do it. So we went from Horseshoe Meadow, so it's like a 37-mile kind of crescent shape hike where you come from the south, go out onto the PCT, and then come back off the PCT over the backside of Whitney.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, and there was a lot of snow up there even in September because we had such a big winter the year before.
Yeah. And that hurricane that came through.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And then after that, I'm planning on doing the Colorado Trail, which is 485 miles from Denver to Durango.
When are you doing it?
July.
What day are you starting?
I'm thinking the 1st or the 2nd.
I'll be a few weeks behind you.
Be a few weeks behind. Huh. Are you going eastbound or westbound?
I'm going from Denver toward Durango.
Huh. Well, we'll see. We'll see what actually ends up happening. Maybe we'll catch each other on the Colorado Trail.
Well, if you're ahead of me, I'm not going to catch you. I'll tell you that.
No.
You're a lot younger than I am. Next question. What's the best backpacking or hiking advice you've ever gotten?
I would just say just keep going is the short, succinct phrase that was given to me. It doesn't matter if you're having a tough day, the mileage sucks, the elevation sucks. This is why we're out here is to go through the hard experience to help us, at least help me process some of the stuff in my life. And it's just keep going. And that applies into my everyday real life is to have that playing in my head. You've gotten through mountains before. You've gone through swamps before. You've hiked in the desert. Just keep going.
It's great advice. And like you said, it applies to life in general. And there's crossover, like you said as well, where the fact that you're able to do that on the trail makes other parts of life where you have those kinds of difficulties, it makes them easier because you're able to just persist. And it really does work. It really is where, hiking is life and life is hiking. So I love that.
Exactly.
All right. Last question. What's the most unexpected thing that's ever happened while you were backpacking or hiking?
So this story comes from after I had flip-flopped in Florida. I was starting to hike south on Lake Okeechobee, so I was close to the Ocean to Lake Trail. I had tested myself the day prior and hiked 40 miles in one day around Lake Okeechobee. So I was pretty burnt out. I was walking into a small little farming town called Clewiston, just off of Lake Okeechobee, just to grab a little Cubano from one of the shops. And I happened to meet some trail angels who took me out to the bar because I don't say no to things while I'm on trail. If you're getting offered drinks, food, you got to say yes,
Right.
And while I was at the bar, I got to meet one of the local farmers. His name was Aaron. He was such a delightful guy. He took me out to his cows, showed me his cows, and let me take a 0 day, which means I hiked 0 miles that day. I did that for 2 days because there happened to have been a music festival called Sugarfest, which is happening in about a week's time over there. I wish I could make it out. But I got to see Grand Funk Railroad while I was hiking the Florida Trail live. And I'm a big musician. I'm a saxophonist, and I listen to 70s, 80s, 60s kind of music. And to see that while I was hiking after spending some time with a farmer and his cows, and pretty much everything was comp for me. They were so nice. It was crazy. And then just to be back in the swamps the next day.
That is very cool. Running into a music festival with a band while you're out there hiking a long distance trail. That's pretty amazing.
And they still rocked Grand Funk Railroad. Yeah, they were a little older. The voices were a little bit lower, but they still rocked.
That's cool. Richie Mulligan, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks again to Richie Mulligan for coming on the show. And I hope that Richie and I have inspired you to hike the Ocean to Lake Trail. And if you enjoyed this episode, tell a friend about it. Or better yet, give us a good review on whichever podcast service you use. And keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense. And when you get back, tell me how it went. So let's talk about our next episode. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, over 2 weeks we'll traverse an entire nation on foot, hiking 280 kilometers or about 175 miles, staying in local villages and small guest houses, eating home-cooked meals. And more amazingly, on this trek, we will see 2 separate oceans. That's right. We start at the Atlantic Ocean and finish the hike at the Pacific Ocean. How is that possible, you might be wondering? Next time, we trek for the first time on Trails Worth Hiking in Central America. We'll hike mar a mar, ocean to ocean, on the Camino de Costa Rica. I also want to mention that there may be a bit of a break before the Camino de Costa Rica episode comes out, but it will be worth the wait, I promise. As you heard in the interview with Richie Mulligan, I am planning to spend a good chunk of the summer out on the Colorado Trail. So wish me luck. And I hope that you are getting out this summer too, and we'll talk again when I get back. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, or ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest and talk about a trail that you've hiked, reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. Also, please follow us on Instagram at Trails Worth Hiking Podcast, and please subscribe on YouTube as well. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.